From The Godfather to Griselda, the mob has been locked into pop culture for decades. Movies, television, and streaming series have turned organized crime into a familiar backdrop, something audiences feel like they understand even if they have never cracked open a court transcript or read a sentencing memo. That visibility comes at a cost. When entertainment takes priority over accuracy, myths spread easily, and over time they harden into something that feels like common knowledge. In some cases, those myths have even shaped how real criminals see themselves, influencing their language, their behavior, and the way they imagine their place in the underworld. Pop culture has built an image of the mob as powerful, disciplined, and guided by a strict sense of honor. It presents an organization that operates by its own moral code, separate from the chaos and brutality of the street. That image is compelling, and it sells tickets. It is also deeply misleading. The reality of organized crime, as documented in police files, wiretaps, and trial records, is far less romantic and far more corrosive, both to the people caught inside it and to the communities around it. Still, these myths did not appear out of thin air. Many of them began as distorted reflections of real practices, real people, and real events. Over time, those fragments of truth were polished, exaggerated, and repackaged for the screen. What remains is a version of the mob that feels authentic, even when it is not. To understand organized crime as it actually exists, you have to separate those fragments from the fiction built around them. That means taking a hard look at the most common myths and measuring them against what the evidence actually shows. One of the oldest ideas attached to organized crime is that civilians are off limits. The mob, according to its own mythology, only kills its own. That belief was summed up neatly by Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, one of the architects of modern Las Vegas. When Siegel took control of the Flamingo Hotel project in the mid-1940s, he brought in Del Webb to oversee construction. Webb quickly learned who he was dealing with. Siegel openly bragged about having killed more than a dozen men. When Webb showed fear, Siegel brushed it aside with a promise that sounded reassuring on the surface. They only killed each other. The implication was clear. If you are not in the life, you are safe. That idea collapses the moment it meets the historical record. Organized crime has never limited its violence to willing participants. In 1982, Michael Donahue left a bar in South Boston and offered an old friend a ride home. The friend was Brian Halloran, and Donahue had no idea he was sitting beside a man already marked for death. James Whitey Bulger, the leader of the Winter Hill Gang, pulled up alongside Donahue's Datsun with an accomplice and opened fire. When the car crashed, Bulger walked up and finished the job, making certain both men were dead. Donahue was not involved in organized crime, was not a witness, and was not a target. His only mistake was being in the wrong car at the wrong time. More than 3 decades later, his murder became one of the counts that helped send Bulger to prison for life. This pattern is not confined to American crime families. In 1992, on a stretch of highway near Capaci, Italian magistrate Giovanni Falcone was driving home with his wife, Francesca Morvillo, when the road beneath them exploded. The blast killed Falcone, Morvillo, and 3 police officers assigned to protect them. The bomb was massive, packed with hundreds of kilograms of explosives hidden in a drainage pipe under the highway. Later testimony from Mafia informant Maurizio Avola described how the device was positioned, using a skateboard to slide it into place. Avola claimed the technique came from an explosive specialist sent by John Gotti. Falcone had spent years dismantling the Sicilian Mafia through meticulous investigations and the Maxi trial, which led to hundreds of convictions. Morvillo was a magistrate herself, but she was not the target. She died because she was in the passenger seat. The officers died because they were doing their jobs. These cases are not exceptions. They are reminders. Whether through mistaken identity, collateral damage, or the simple convenience of removing witnesses, organized crime kills whoever it decides to kill. The promise that civilians are safe has always been a lie told to make violence easier to live with. The bodies left behind tell a different story. Movies love the idea that Las Vegas sprang fully formed from the imagination of gangsters. According to that version of history, the desert was empty until men like Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, fictionalized as Mo Green, arrived and invented a city out of neon and gunsmoke. It is a clean story. It is also wrong. Long before Siegel arrived, Las Vegas was already on a steady upward climb. Las Vegas began as a railroad town in 1905, not a gambling outpost. Its growth accelerated in the early 1930s when construction began on Hoover Dam. The dam brought thousands of workers, federal money, roads, power, and permanence. In 1931, Nevada legalized gambling statewide, and casinos spread quickly to meet the demand of a growing population with disposable income. By the time Siegel ever laid eyes on the city, it was no backwater. It was already a functioning, expanding municipality with infrastructure, hotels, and gambling halls. When East Coast mobsters first took an interest in Las Vegas, the Strip was already taking shape. 2 casinos were operating before Siegel's involvement, the El Rancho Vegas and the Last Frontier. The real opportunity came with the Flamingo. Billy Wilkerson, the publisher of The Hollywood Reporter, envisioned a glamorous resort modeled after European destinations. He began building the Flamingo Hotel, but ran out of money before it was finished. That was when mob financing entered the picture. Siegel came to Las Vegas as the mob's representative, not as a visionary founder. He later forced Wilkerson out and took control of the Flamingo himself. What followed was not a triumph, but a mess. Costs ballooned wildly, eventually reaching around $6 million, an enormous sum for the time. When the Flamingo opened in December 1946, the hotel rooms were not ready, guests could not stay, and the casino bled money. To his financial backers back east, it looked less like bad management and more like theft. Those suspicions sealed Siegel's fate. On June 20th, 1947, he was shot and killed at a girlfriend's home in Beverly Hills. His death came before the mob's most profitable years in Las Vegas even began. The idea that Siegel built the city collapses on that timeline alone. He was gone before Las Vegas entered its true golden age. There is, however, a sliver of truth buried in the legend. The mob did not create Las Vegas, but it did change its tone. Early Strip casinos leaned heavily on Western themes and modest budgets. Mob money brought scale, polish, and entertainment experience learned in places like New York, Chicago, and Havana. Even accounting for waste and corruption, the Flamingo's budget dwarfed earlier casinos, including El Rancho Vegas, which had been built for under $500,000. Las Vegas did not owe its existence to the mob. What it absorbed from organized crime was ambition, spectacle, and a willingness to skim profits without regard for the long-term damage. The city was already standing when the mob arrived. They did not invent it. They exploited it. One of the most persistent myths about organized crime is that drugs are off-limits. Popular culture helped lock that idea in place, especially after a single line spoken by Don Corleone suggested narcotics were beneath the dignity of serious men. The truth is that this belief did not come from Hollywood alone. It was seeded by the mob itself, carefully repeated until it sounded like policy rather than public relations. Joseph Bonanno, boss of the Bonanno crime family, made that claim explicit in his autobiography, A Man of Honor. He wrote that he did not tolerate prostitution or narcotics, and suggested that, while other families may have ignored such standards, his administration did not. On paper, it sounded principled. In practice, it did not hold up. Bonanno later collaborated directly with the Sicilian Mafia in 1957 to import heroin into the United States, part of a pipeline that became known to investigators as the French Connection. What was written for history and what happened behind closed doors were not the same thing. Drug trafficking had already been part of American organized crime long before Bonanno tried to distance himself from it. Federal anti-narcotics laws began tightening in 1915, and almost immediately drugs appeared alongside gambling and prostitution in police reports. In Chicago, opium dens were regularly linked to operations run by Big Jim Colosimo, whose organization later evolved into the Chicago Outfit. In New York, Charles Lucky Luciano received his first criminal conviction in 1916 for selling heroin, earning 6 months in jail. Years later, after reshaping the American Mafia, Luciano played a key role in recruiting Sicilian mafiosi to handle street-level heroin distribution. The arrangement insulated American bosses while keeping the money flowing. There were moments when the consequences of drug dealing forced the issue into the open. Louis Lepke Buchalter, one of the founders of Murder, Inc., was sentenced in 1940 to 14 years in prison for running a heroin trafficking ring that moved massive quantities of the drug into the United States. Vito Genovese followed in 1959 when he was convicted on narcotics charges and sentenced to 15 years. For an aging mob boss, it amounted to a slow death sentence behind bars. These cases made drugs dangerous, not immoral. A small number of bosses tried to enforce a genuine ban. Paul Castellano, head of the Gambino family, issued a clear rule. If you dealt drugs, you were marked for death. That policy put him at odds with a younger generation that saw narcotics as too profitable to ignore. Among them was John Gotti. Castellano might have ordered Gotti killed for violating that rule, but he never got the chance. In 1985, Gotti had Castellano murdered outside Sparks Steakhouse in Manhattan. Gotti avoided serious drug convictions and was ultimately sentenced to life in prison in 1992 for murder and racketeering. His family was not so fortunate. His brother Gene Gotti was convicted on narcotics charges in 1989 and sentenced to 50 years in prison, a penalty that reflected just how deeply drug trafficking was embedded in mob operations. The record is clear: drugs were never outside the business. They were debated, denied, and occasionally punished, but they were always there. In organized crime, moral lines exist only until the money on the other side becomes too large to ignore. Few events in American history have attracted as much suspicion as the assassination of John F. Kennedy on November 22, 1963, in Dallas, Texas. In the decades since, nearly every powerful institution and figure imaginable has been accused of involvement. The CIA, the FBI, the KGB, pro-Castro groups, anti-Castro groups, even Kennedy's own Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson and FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. Organized crime was folded into that list early, and once it was there, it never really left. Names like Sam Giancana, Santo Trafficante Jr., and Carlos Marcello became permanent fixtures in assassination law. The mob-centered theory leans heavily on one man, Jack Ruby, who shot Lee Harvey Oswald inside the basement of Dallas Police Headquarters 2 days after the assassination. Ruby's act ensured Oswald would never face trial, and it guaranteed that unanswered questions would multiply. Ruby was a nightclub owner, and like many men in that business during the era, he had crossed paths with organized crime figures. That surface-level connection became the foundation for far more elaborate claims. Ruby's background tells a less cinematic story. Born in Chicago, he had minor dealings with mob figures on the city's west side, functioning at times as an errand runner. According to organized crime historian Gus Russo, Ruby was eventually pushed out of Chicago because police questioned him repeatedly. He had a reputation for talking. In the underworld, that kind of attention is a death sentence for trust. Men who inform or are even suspected of informing do not get promoted. They get isolated. They are not handed the responsibility of silencing the most important witness in American history. That reality undercuts the idea of Ruby as a mob cleanup man. Organized crime relies on discipline and control, especially when stakes are high. Ruby was volatile, emotional, and known to law enforcement. He was the last person a serious crime boss would depend on to close a conspiracy without unraveling it. Whatever his motives for killing Oswald, and historians still debate them, they do not fit the profile of a calculated mob operation. There is no question that some mobsters despised the Kennedy administration. With Robert F. Kennedy as Attorney General, organized crime became a top federal target. Prosecutions increased, surveillance expanded, long-standing arrangements collapsed. Santo Traficante Jr. was later reported to have raised a private toast to his lawyer hours after the assassination, a gesture often cited as evidence of foreknowledge. That claim remains unproven and stands alone, unsupported by documents or corroborated testimony. What is well established is how the Mafia historically handled risk. The organization survived by staying beneath the surface, not by detonating events that would bring overwhelming attention. In 1935, when New York bootlegger Dutch Schultz proposed assassinating prosecutor Thomas Dewey, the response from Mafia leadership was swift. Schultz was murdered instead. Killing a public official of that stature was seen as suicidal, not strategic. Assassinating a sitting president would have been something else entirely. It would have unleashed every federal agency, military intelligence unit, and law enforcement body in the country with no political restraint. For an organization built to extract money quietly through gambling, labor racketeering, and extortion, that kind of exposure would be catastrophic. The mob had motives to resent Kennedy. It had reasons to fear his administration. What it did not have was a rational incentive to kill him. The historical record offers no credible evidence tying organized crime to the assassination itself. What remains is suspicion layered onto silence, amplified by the fact that Lee Harvey Oswald died before he could speak. That vacuum has never been filled, and into it, every theory has rushed. The idea that the mob helped put John F. Kennedy in the White House has been repeated so often that it now feels settled. Movies frame it as a quiet backroom favor, a deal cut with precinct captains and ward healers, sealed by fear and ballot boxes. According to that version, the fix came through Illinois, and Chicago delivered the presidency. It is a clean explanation for a close election. It is also one that collapses when measured against what can actually be verified. Organized crime did have political influence in the early 20th century, especially in cities where political machines dominated local government. In New York, Tammany Hall thrived on patronage and corruption, and criminals sometimes benefited from that system. By the 1950s, that world was shrinking. Senate investigations, public hearings, and sustained press coverage had made political corruption far more dangerous and far more visible. The mob still existed, but its reach into formal politics was weaker and riskier than it had been decades earlier. Rumors have long claimed that Joseph P. Kennedy approached Chicago mobsters and asked them to help secure Illinois for his son, John F. Kennedy, during the 1960 election. There is no reliable evidence that such a request was ever made. When Kennedy competed for the Democratic nomination and later the presidency, the Chicago outfit was a diminished organization compared to its Capone-era peak. Its influence extended into only 5 of Chicago's 50 wards, and even there, its manpower was limited. Those limitations matter. The outfit did not have the numbers to intimidate voters on a scale large enough to swing a statewide election. A statistical analysis conducted by Chicago organized crime historian John J. Binder examined voting patterns from the 1960 election. His findings showed that wards historically associated with outfit influence followed the same Democratic voting trends as the rest of Chicago. There was no statistical spike that suggested mass manipulation. Investigators did uncover suspicious activity in a down-ticket race for state's attorney, but even there, irregularities were limited to roughly 6,000 ballots out of nearly 500,000 cast. The real power in Chicago politics at the time belonged to Richard J. Daley. Daley's Democratic machine controlled precinct captains, city jobs, and an enormous network of favors and obligations. That apparatus had the resources and organization to deliver votes, and it did so routinely. Kennedy's narrow victory in Illinois fits squarely within that reality. Daley did not need the mob to move voters. He already owned the system that counted them. That does not mean the outfit was politically irrelevant. It could and did exert pressure in local elections, especially when its own survival was at stake. In the 1955 Chicago mayoral race, outfit-linked wards showed statistically significant support for Daley when he ran against reform candidate Robert Merriam, who campaigned on ending the city's tolerance of racketeers. In those moments, self-preservation aligned with machine politics. What the outfit did not anticipate was the future. While rumors painted Kennedy as friendly to organized crime, the threat was already sitting beside him. Robert F. Kennedy, his younger brother, had built his career confronting corruption. As chief counsel to Senator John McClellan, he had aggressively questioned mob figures and Teamsters boss Jimmy Hoffa during the Senate hearings on labor racketeering. Those hearings were public, hostile, and deeply personal. If organized crime had truly engineered Kennedy's election, it would have been an astonishing act of self-destruction. The historical record points elsewhere. Kennedy won Illinois because a powerful political machine delivered it. The mob's role exists largely in rumor, repetition, and the need for a dramatic explanation. The evidence does not support the story.